Recently, there has been a lot of talk about Rumble Jungle at the Mid-Season Invitational, also known as MSI, and there's been a lot of talk about whether this champion is actually good or bad in the jungle role. I specifically have went on Twitter, starting as early as like late April, I think April 20th, something like that, 420, I was on Twitter saying Rumble Jungle is the best pick in the game, and it will be a dominant factor at MSI. The teams that adapt to picking Rumble Jungle will end up performing better than the teams that don't. This is a take that I've had from playing the game and then also just seeing the buffs and understanding what makes a jungler strong. Obviously, the results of Rumble Jungle have been hit or miss at MSI. There hasn't been a huge amount of games. We don't have a bunch of data, not a huge sample size, but generally speaking, the pick has not been performing as well as the teams have prioritized it. Obviously, if you take a pick first in the draft, you expect it to be one of the absolute best champions that is available on the patch. Recently, I saw some tweets, specifically from Phreaky, about how this pick actually is not a good jungler, and he provided some stats as to why he believes it not to be a good jungler. I'm going to show you the initial tweet here. I obviously took exception to this. I tweeted about why this is such an incorrect representation of the champion, but I'm just going to go ahead and read the tweet so that we're all on the same page as to where this started. So on May 11th, David Phreaky Turley decided to post on Twitter saying that he saw some stats saying that Rumble is 3-7 at MSI so far. If you don't count RNG's completely free wins, regardless of comp, the champion is giga overrated in that role. He's a good mid laner. He's a bad jungler. Draft better. First thing I want to address is the obvious connotation here. By saying draft better, it's obviously supposed to be super condescending. It's supposed to be from a place of authority. Like, I know how to draft. You don't know how to draft. Like, this is what's actually correct, and you can't be right. There's no room for discussion. It's not like hey, I think that Rumble might be a little bit overrated by these teams, or the fact that these junglers have been underperforming on it. Maybe it should lose priority within the draft. Nothing like that is actually said here. It's just this champion is bad. It's a bad jungler. It's a good mid laner. Draft better. Put him mid if you're going to draft him. Don't put him jungle. So first thing I want to address here is just the stats themselves. There's solo queue stats here. And I'm not really sure what the purpose of these are, besides to just show that in solo queue, mid laners that have been playing Rumble for years, presumably, have a better win rate on this patch than junglers. One thing that you can see here is that based on these stats, we've seen a progression where when played at a higher tier, Master significantly higher than D2, Diamond, Platinum, etc., also a bigger division than the rest of them, you're seeing a big win rate spike once it gets to Master tier. So one thing that I'm seeing here originally is that as you get to higher tiers, the champion generally functions better. Obviously, a bunch of reasons, like I said earlier, because Rumble mid is something that's been played for a long period of time. There's tons of one tricks that actually play Rumble in solo queue. This could be inflated because most of the people that are playing jungle Rumble have not played Rumble before. They're having problems managing heat. They're having problems aiming the ult. Rumble is a champion that functions differently to almost every other champion in the game. The heat mechanic is extremely unique. Having a self-silence when you overheat and being able to manage your heat to perfectly know when you should be casting and when you should be trying to output maximum damage with auto attacks is a unique skill set. Also, the way the ult is used, anyone that's played Rumble for the first time has probably thrown a dog shit ult left to right, and shown that, like, yeah, you definitely need some games on this champion for the champion to be viable. Now, the thing that I wanted to talk about here is just the direct misrepresentation of the stats. Phreaky says Rumble is 3-7 at MSI so far if you don't count RNG's free wins regardless of comp. Number one, this is just incorrect. It's actually 4-7 at MSI. I mean, you could say without the Rumble free losses or whatever in the jungle from RNG, it could be 4-8 if you're talking about all of Rumble, because it had 4 wins outside of RNG's wins, and then it also has an extra loss on mid Rumble, which is something that Chaz picked in the group stage. But outside of that, there's this premise of we take away all of RNG's wins. Now, this is something that's like rather arbitrary. Okay, you can take away wins if you want from the team that's playing it the best, but at the very least, you have to be intellectually honest with the data. If you're saying that any time that RNG plays a champion, we can't use it to track anything because they automatically win regardless of their comp in that group, you also have to say that the teams playing against RNG automatically lose regardless of what they draft to. I think it's super dishonest to be counting games where Rumble has lost to RNG, but not counting games where Rumble is winning while on RNG. If you go here, You can see the stats for these games. The reason why there's 2 extra ones is because Blabber and Elyoya actually played today, whereas when the tweet was made, he was talking obviously about the group stage. So out of this, there's other things that you can look at. You can look at the people that played it. Generally speaking, the wild cards, I mean, wild cards obviously lost more games, but wild cards made up for most of the losses. Outside of the wild cards, you look at the teams that play it. Okay, Blabber was 1-0 on it. Elyoya was 1-0 on it. River was 2-1. Wei was 3-0. Pretty decent stats. It seems like the players that were the best junglers at the tournament actually performed better on Rumble than the people from wildcard regions. Wildcard Rumbles didn't look that good. Another thing that we can throw in here is that there was like a Lee Sin level eye test being applied to this. You could clearly see, as somebody who understands the game, that the Rumbles were super, super uncomfortable on the champion if you understand what a good Rumble looks like. People were overheating at bad times. Ultimates have been terrible. Even to this point in the competition, ultimates have been super, super bad on Rumble. People are not able to aim it. People don't know how to use it properly. We've seen some wacky rune selection, Predator from Blabber. We've seen Conqueror from Canyon. Neither of these seem to be that great. We saw specifically today, Blabber pretty much lose a 3v3 single-handedly by not managing his heat properly. And obviously, if you do not play this champion close to its skill level, it's going to get absolutely ran down by things like Udyr that are pretty brain dead in general. Anyway, the goalpost kind of moved. Originally, we were talking about, hey, is Rumble good at MSI? And suddenly, the conversation came to this video that Phreaky released, which said, can you use, which essentially answers the question, can you use solo queue win rates in pro play? And yeah, title is Rumble's a mid laner. So the beginning of this video is essentially him just explaining times, like just making the claim that pros are infallible. I agree with this claim. Pros are not infallible. I agree with these claims. Like they definitely make mistakes. Pros have issues and sometimes they play poorly on things that are strong, and sometimes they ignore things that are strong because they don't think it'll work, and once it comes into the meta, people end up doing super well on it. I would say that generally speaking, pros have a decent approach to the game. They're smart about what they're picking for the most part, but they definitely do make mistakes. I don't think anyone's arguing that, and I don't think that that's like a point that I really want to contest. Essentially, the point that I want to contest is that solo queue data is not necessarily indicative of the results of a champion in pro play. A champion can be really strong in pro play and be dog shit in solo queue. A champion can be super, super good in solo queue and be terrible in pro play. You know, the highest win rate champion in the game is Shaco. I don't know why no one's talking about bringing this champion into pro play. Obviously, people don't think it works against the champions that are being played right now. Rumble, Morgana, Udyr, you get out cleared. You really have to rely on people making mistakes to do anything in the game. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that they necessarily have a one-to-one correlation, and that's the thing that I kind of want to argue here. I'm gonna let Phreaky display, and I actually DM'd Phreaky, and he said that I could use this footage in order to make my video, so I could, you know, not have to quote him constantly, like out of context. I could just let him talk and then say where I disagree. So we're just gonna play the video from right now, and we'll talk about places which I disagree.
So what can data do, or more generally, what even are statistics? Simply, they are a measure of what happened, and that's it. They don't by themselves imply a single thing. They just measure what happened. This is why anyone who tells you that statistics are bullshit is honestly just uneducated. Statistics are a measure of the real world. In some ways, they are the truest things on the planet because your theories and perceptions don't matter. The real world does. It's what people
feelings don't care about facts.
Used poorly, you can do all sorts of malicious things to twist the actual facts into horrible arguments. But that's not our plan here. We want to use data to help us learn. Because after all, these things factually happened, and it's up to us to understand the world in such a way that these results make sense. We want to harness the power of millions of games, because the biggest grinder in the LCS only played 500 games and didn't even branch out that much. Now, only 4 to 5 games of solo queue a day, every day after practice and matches, is a lot of gaming, to be clear. But that's all that it gets you. This isn't meant as a diss on Core JJ. There's no way you're getting reps on new champions and exploring new ones, and then getting reps on the promising results from those explorations. But measure what happened in solo queue is not the same thing as predicting what could happen in pro. We can move in that direction, though, is the thing. One of the strongest
Potentially.
things we can do with solo queue data as it relates to pro play is measure win rate against MMR brackets. Pro play is not identical to solo queue, but it is still League of Legends.
Okay, so I want to talk about this. This is one thing that you're going to have to keep in your mind now. I kind of want to interject and just explain something that it took me a while. Like, I've watched this video 5 or 6 times in entirety just to make sure that I completely understand his argument. Something that I learned from Thorin was just like the best way to try to understand somebody else is and measure your argument against theirs is you try to steel man their argument, make their argument as strong as possible, and then see where you actually disagree. If you can't fully explain what the other person is saying, then you probably don't have good points as to why you disagree with it.
By looking at a champion's performance in a lower skill bracket and comparing it to a higher skill bracket, we can get a sense of direction.
It's true.
Let's take a look at Azir, the quintessential pro champion. Now, if all you did was look at the first page of solo queue data in front of you, you'd say, "Wow, Azir is trash. He's 4% weaker than he's 4% weaker than the average mid laner." And you'd be right if you were focused on winning platinum level solo queue games. But we're not interested in applying platinum solo queue to pro play. We want to apply League of Legends to pro play. So let's get a better picture. Azir is in fact weak in platinum, but how does his performance change with player skill? Really positively, it turns out. A quick note on the red line. This is R squared. R squared is basically a measure of how well one variable explains. Well, it's
a trend line. So you're essentially what he's going to explain to you is that, you know, you can see with the trend line where the data is heading, right? Like, what you could assume from this is that, you know, as people get better and better at the champion, or people get better and better at League of Legends, the champion gets better and better results. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely some validity in this. Now, I think that the idea of what you should be using solo queue data for as a pro player, and somebody who's done this myself before, was to give yourself options, like to, you know, try different things. I don't think that just because something has a high win rate necessarily means that it is good. It could be good in solo queue, but essentially you're playing 2 different games. In solo queue, there's a massive lack of coordination. Now, this is something that he touches on later, but he very rarely, like, he doesn't talk about it in depth. He talks about it for like maybe 10 or 20 seconds and then just like throws it by the wayside. He gives an example of a champion, which we'll see later, Rise, that had pretty bad win rate across the board, but then was good in pro play. Now, I don't see what discludes Rumble from being the same type of champion. If that's a possibility, why do we have to say that based on these win rates, suddenly Rumble is bad? Now, obviously, Phreaky could be meaning something more than this, but based on what I've seen in this tweet, there's no context. Really, from what I'm seeing here is he gives a stat on MSI, right? He's like, okay, so Rumble is underperforming at MSI. It's a botch stat that's super disingenuous. He's manipulating it to its fullest in order to make his point. But then all he provides is other data, right? So like he's saying, hey, the champ is bad. Here's some win rates to like prove his point. What else can I infer from this? I would much rather him explain to me why Rumble Jungle is bad. I think that there is a weakness to Rumble Jungle. I think that probably the biggest weakness of the champion is level 1 invades, but I think that that's obviously something that you can deal with. I mean, there's been tons of champions that have been meta. Rek'Sai was a horrible level 1 champion, and people were able to make him work, regardless of the fact that people knew that they could invade him. Invade her, actually. Sorry, I got to be politically correct here. Another example is Hecarim. Hecarim was just in the meta forever. Hecarim's another example of a champion that is really susceptible to late invades. So I think that there are weaknesses of the champion, but to me, I think that there's way more strengths. This is the part that I would like to argue. What actually makes Rumble bad? He has a fast clear. He is good scaling for a jungler up until late game, and I'm talking about like super late game. Up in the mid game, this champion is absolutely insane. One of the lowest ultimate cooldowns in the entire game out of major team fight impacting ultimates. He's one of the best skirmishers in the game. He's got top tier long range follow up, which means that he's good at assisting his teammates. If his teammates are making a play far away from him, he might be able to assist that by cutting off a choke. He does a ton of fucking damage, which is something that I thought Phreaky would probably appreciate. He combos well with a bunch of champions that are potentially in the meta right now. Qiyana, not so much, but the rest of these we've seen played. I think we actually have seen play of Qiyana at MSI, but Set got a buff recently. Nautilus, Sylas. Obviously, Sylas is dependent on what ults that Sylas has to steal, but pretty much any type of CC, which pro teams generally love, Rumble is great follow-up and a great combo with these champions. How about the fact that he's manaless? How about the fact that if we expand on this, it's not just that he's a great skirmisher. He beats champions 1v1, he beats champions 2v2 and 3v3. He's a monster. So he's one of the best skirmishers in multiple different situations. Some champions thrive in smaller fights. For example, Udyr would much rather fight a 2v2 than a 3v3, essentially because of the fact that as more CC abilities come in, because he can only auto attack, he might not be able to walk at somebody and get onto somebody as free. Here's one. He has a 45 to 55 second ultimate CD at level 11, one of the best ultimates in the entire game, especially in a meta that is focused on dragons. If you watch how teams play at MSI, there's a huge importance from these teams on the dragon. And if you have an ultimate that is so good in dragon fights, shouldn't it also be something that should be considered a strength based on what we're seeing at this tournament? I feel like these are the points that I want to hear. Like, what actually makes Rumble bad? It can't be like just his win rate, right? So what is the real argument? If the champion's bad, he's bad for a reason. There's something that the champion is lacking that other people that other people are seeing that I don't. From my point of view, the main problem that I see is that people in general are incapable of playing him well at MSI. Like the amount of skill that the champion takes might be underrated by me. I probably thought that most of these junglers would be able to pick it up. We have seen really good rumbles, but then again, we haven't seen that many junglers at the tournament. Like, it's a very small sample size. Most of the junglers are wildcards or from weaker region, from wildcard regions. So yeah, I think that could be definitely a reason as to why we've been seeing such lackluster Rumble play. Just from the eye test, you can see that these things are true, right? Like, heat management has been awful, the ultimate usage has been awful, and people just feel like they just don't play the champion, right? Which makes sense. I'm completely on board with all that, and I can even accept that maybe people need to stop playing Rumble at this tournament. I think that if you're Wei, you still keep it super high priority, but teams like RNG, you've seen, even though they can play Rumble really well, they'd rather take an Udyr away from Cloud9 and dare the people that have not had good Rumble performances to actually perform on the champion. Okay, so let's continue listening to the video.
Trend line, and then we're measuring R-squared with it. But R-squared is basically a measure of how well one variable explains the other. Using just solo queue MMR and nothing else, I could explain 90% of the win rate change Azir has across skill brackets. That's honestly really, really good, considering we're like taking bronze to masters as a linear progression through skill tiers. And it's you know, not, but hey, it's still pretty good, right? Lo and behold, somewhere to the right of this graph is where Azir would perform in pro play.
This is the main thing. This is what you need to catch on to. It took me a while to catch on to like why I disagreed with this so much. So what he does here, and he does it actually in a really intelligent way, is he kind of just implies that there is a tier that is going to be like kind of relevant here called pro, but he doesn't even define what the tier is. This is actually the most important part. Because for me, when I see 787 games, I'm like, oh my God, that's a fuck ton of games. How many people are playing Azir? So what you end up doing, and we'll get into this later with Lilia, is you start seeing what pro tier actually means. Pro is not just, to me, like when I hear pro, I'm thinking of LPL, I'm thinking of LCK, I'm thinking of LEC, I'm thinking of LCS. Like, these are the things that jump to my mind because those are the regions I watch. The majority of the data that he's using in this pro tier is nowhere close to these regions. It's further below these regions. He's using regional leagues. He's even using NA Academy. I can show you on Games of Legends, which is the site that I'm going to use here, in a couple seconds when we get to Lilia, how far down you have to go to get close to the numbers that he's getting. I understand you want a sample size, but saying that all these leagues are similar skill is really disingenuous. Clearly, a minor regional league like the Nordic League, or maybe I guess the Nordic League ended up making the finals of E-Masters. You get the point, though. Like the Dutch League, for example, in Europe, those statistics should not be grouped in the same tier with LPL statistics and LCK statistics. It just doesn't make sense, right? Like, even if they are similar or they follow the same trend, I don't think you can make this blanket statement that this is now the pro tier. It's something that I don't agree with. We don't have this pro tier. So he accepts this as a premise, and he makes you accept it as a premise to understand all of his points within the video. But it's actually something that I think is really, really unfair, and it's disingenuous to the skill difference between pro leagues. Pro leagues are not all the same. I would say there's a bigger difference between platinum and master tier. Or sorry, I would say there's a bigger difference between some of the low leagues and the top tier leagues than there is between platinum and master tier. It's a better way to say it. Okay, let's continue.
He's got about 3 times the pick and ban rate of the average champion and wins a bit more than average as well. Azir lines up perfectly with the expectations drawn from solo queue data. And before you yell out, wait a second, of course champs win more and higher MMR. The players are better. Don't worry. I've got you covered. This isn't just win rate. This is contrasting Azir to the average mid laner at that skill level.
Okay, so we're going to skip ahead here. Like, I just wanted to let him finish making his point. That's essentially his point on Azir. Now he's going to show you the inverse of it, where it's like, hey, there's champions that get worse as you go up through, or you go through higher brackets of skill. So the ones he uses are Mumu and Garen. It's fine to me. I don't have any real gripes with that. But to me, just because this trend makes sense for Azir doesn't mean that it applies to everyone, right? And then there's other champions that he shows and he talks about, like he just made an Azir point. It took like 3 minutes when he talks about Ryze having a relatively low win rate in solo queue, and then in competitive play looks completely fine. It's a completely viable champion. He does that for like 10 seconds, 20 seconds. So it makes it seem like it's not as valid of a point. All right. So he talks about Garen, he talks about Amumu, and then he gets into Lilia. Now Lilia is something I definitely want to talk about.
Some people believe champs are accordingly.
Here.
But not all champs are like this. Some people believe champs are good when they aren't. It often comes down to just blindly copying one another without being analytical enough about the game. Lilia simply isn't very good. Her win rates are substantially below that of her peers, and there isn't...
It's not very good right now, and it's not that good in solo queue. I'll give you that. I think at the top level of pro play, it's completely fine. I think it was used really, really well by some of the teams that we are now seeing are the best teams in the world.
A strong pro or even anti-pro slope. Clearly, a simple skill and performance line doesn't do that much to describe Lilia. Regardless, the seeming parabolic win rate is actually kind of interesting and somewhat common. I would love to learn one day what that's about, but again, it's not that strong here, so we're going to ignore it for now. Regardless, if you truly think that this parabolic win rate change is enough that somewhere post-Masters she actually catches up to other junglers, and then surpasses them enough to be a top-tier jungler in pro and not just simply viable, that's a really bold claim. Now, at least it's based in some logic and some data, but I guess you could hold the claim that Lilia is a pro champ after all.
Which it could be based in some logic, it could be based in some data. I mean, the data that I'm going to use to talk about that is LPL. Like, LPL to me is the strongest league in the world. I don't think that many people would contest that these days. I mean, there's a question of, is Dom1 still the best team in the world? But I think that domestically, LPL has shown that it is by far above every other region, at least better than every other region besides for LCK. I think that you can say that definitely based off all the results we've seen over the last 11 years of competitive League of Legends. China has clearly been the second best region after Korea, and in recent years has even overtaken it in terms of skill level of the league. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that we can use. So let's just look at this for a second.
But that's not what pros think today. See, pros have been jumping ship like Lilia's the Titanic for months. If you stopped looking after 11.4, you'd think, oh, wow, most teams were behind the meta earlier in the year. But if you look today, only the slowest to adapt teams are still concerned about here.
And this is like very easy to explain, right? Like in recent times, a lot of junglers have been buffed, so now we have other options. Before, Lilia was one of the few options. How about the fact that Lilia was nerfed? How about the fact that Lilia received indirect nerfs? The CDR boots changed. That obviously affected Lilia. Lilia was one of the champions that loved rushing CDR boots most. That was like core part of Lilia's playstyle. Being able to full clear, buy CDR boots, potentially with Predator, and then gank a lane. How about the fact that the champion had a 20-second ult cooldown that was nerfed later on? I think that that's a pretty significant nerf. It definitely deserves to be in the conversation, but these things are skipped over to give you the impression that pros were just playing Lilia and then they randomly stopped playing Lilia, where that didn't actually happen. I think a big problem with Riot is the understanding of indirect and indirect buffs. Like, direct buffs, everyone understands. Indirect buffs are normally left out of the equation, right? So when CDR boots gets nerfed, the champions that rely on pathing to get those CDR boots and that are really strong with CDR boots, they're going to see some effects from that. Obviously, when Ravenous Hunter gets nerfed, that's going to be something that's going to affect Lilia because Lilia loved using Ravenous Hunter. Hecarim sometimes used Ravenous Hunter. Most people actually took Legend Tenacity and Triumph secondary after Phase Rush. And Udyr pretty much always took Legend Tenacity, Phase Rush. Legend Tenacity, Phase Rush, Triumph. Sometimes they would take Inspiration Tree. But overall, like, Ravenous Hunter nerf is going to affect Lilia more than those champions. So the other thing I want to talk about is you look at Lilia in Pro. Lilia in Pro. So this is the thing. Gives you the interpretation that you're talking about like really, really high level play. You're not. That's just what he's trying to make you believe. So when you click Lilia Jungle, right? And you look at stats for Spring, Season 11. We're not going to even just... we can look at just Spring, right? Because that doesn't include preseason, whatever. Lilia is 51 wins, 49 losses. Positive win rate. No problem with that. So how do you actually get a win rate of 48% with that many games. Look at how many games, 998 games. I couldn't even find out how to do it on Games of Legends. I added all these. I added all the top regions, all the wildcard regions, all the ERLs, right? And then I also typed here, I was like, Academy maybe? I click that. Let's refresh and see what it gives us. Doesn't even give us that amount of games. It gives 943 games. So I don't even know where the extra 50 games came from. But this is going really, really deep to make the argument that this is considered a pro tier. You're not even considering tier 1 leagues. You're considering all the regional leagues in Europe. You're not even considering just the major regions. You're considering all the wildcard regions as well. Not only that, you're considering Academy, which is obviously a lower level than, to me, pro. Like when I think pro, I think LCS, I think tier 1. And I think a lot of other people do too. And yeah, to me, I just think it's really disingenuous to make this claim because there's no real definition of what pro is. So once again, it makes you accept the premise that pro play is this tier that is somewhere like on this graph. But it's really not. The pro tier we're talking about is pretty much just like more solo queue. Like I would say that if you were to look at a lot of these random regional leagues, you're not really getting a full experience of what pro tier is. Okay, so let's keep on listening.
Let's dig a bit deeper into pro presence. Her highest pick ban rate was at the height of Turbo Chemtank. Chemtank was buffed in 11.2, and consequently both Hecarim and Udyr kept gaining and climbing patch after patch. Both of them had over 90% presence by 11.5, and yet Lilia rose alongside them, despite being obviously an inferior choice to those two. So please.
So I don't necessarily agree with that either. Historically, now let's go back and let's remove all these. Let's just look at LPL, because this is the region that's clearly the best, right? And I don't know, you could just look at like top, right? Let's just look at top instead, because, and I'm going to delete Worlds, MSI, Midseason Championship, because that was after the nerfs. And we're just going to talk about, Spring Split. I think that's fair. IM is going to go out. We're going to go LMS out. Refresh. Well, now we're seeing, oh shit, it's looking a little bit worse. I wonder why that is. But if you look at the champions that it's being played into, in 66 games, it actually had positive win rate into Udyr. So it's like Lilia was being used as a counterpick to Udyr. Let's see if we go even higher. Now, one thing that I want you guys to just see real quick is if you just look at the LCS win rate. And I think that this is where Phreaky gets a lot of his impression from. I don't know how much time he actually has to watch other regions. I can't make an assessment, but I would assume that he mainly watches LCS. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he watches all the regions just like I do. Who knows? But in LCS, it's significantly worse. Lilia's was significantly worse than it was in LPL. Obviously, not the biggest sample size in the world, but I think that these are much like, if we're using a 15-game sample size to determine that Rumble is a bad pick in MSI, actually, we're using less than that. We're using like a 10-game sample size, and we're moving random wins. Like, if we're going to use that as some type of data and try to interpret that, I think you could definitely use like 54 games of LCS. Now, if you look at LPL, we refresh it. Wow, so the team that was the best team in LPL had 80% win rate. Not only that, in 27 games, Lilia had 63% win rate into Udyr. So maybe against the field, Lilia was a bad choice. I'm not even sure if that's true. I think that Lilia just required a lot of skill, and it was hard to actually get good at Lilia compared to a champion like Udyr and Hecarim, which you can pretty much first time and understand what the champion is doing. I would say that it's a pick that definitely countered some of the Turbo Tank meta champions. So when those champions were good, Lilia was good. When those champions get nerfed, and Lilia gets nerfed, Lilia is no longer good. I think that's a much more accurate representation of what the picture really is.
Please tell me again how we should trust pros in the short term. 11.4 was the peak.
We shouldn't trust pros in the short term. That's why the 15 games at MSI doesn't matter for how good Rumble is. What actually matters is what the champion brings to the table, what the strengths and weaknesses are. You should be doing some type of contrast in your head as to like, is this valuable? What is the reasoning as to why it's not working out? Are people just bad at Rumble? Is the champion bad itself? What are strengths and weaknesses of the champion, and how can we use it in the future?
Of Lilia pick ban. It was actually one of her weakest points. It was the very patch that Moonstone Manure got its first nerf. Considering pros went for Moonstone in about 1/6 of her games this season, they should have lowered her pick and ban rate, not raised it. Thankfully, teams eventually came to their senses 4 months into the season. After all the regular season games were done and most teams were eliminated from regional playoffs, her pick and ban rate finally dropped below 50% with 0 direct changes to the champion, only nerfs to her competitors.
0 direct changes to the champion, by the way. 20-second nerf on the ultimate. seems pretty significant at all ranks. What about indirect changes? Why do those not count? Zonya's Rush, something that people were doing a lot earlier in the season. Remember when people were rushing Seeker's Arm Guard because it was that broken on jungle? Not only did they nerf it here, they also nerfed it previously, where they increased 100 gold onto the cost. What about when people were rushing Verdant Barrier? Like, these are items that Lilia uses, definitely should be worth mentioning in the conversation, definitely could be factored in as indirect nerfs. What about the fact Ravenous Hunter was changed, and she was one of the biggest Ravenous Hunter users? Like, all these points are just skipped over to give you a false impression of what the data actually means.
See, now we're at 11.9, where Moonstone is functionally deleted from the game. But remember, that should only account for 1/6 of Lilia's games, and she's at 14% presence. Finally, in May of 2021, most teams have come to the conclusion that I had in the middle of last year. Lilia isn't very good.
So you had this conclusion in the middle of last year when it was a completely different champion, and the champion was significantly stronger, both directly and indirectly. And now, like, we're just shitting on the pro teams for, like, not understanding that the champion was bad when it was actually good. It just makes no sense. Like, I completely disagree with this point. I think that this is just an example of skewing the data. It's exactly what he said earlier, right? Like, you can skew data to make it sound differently. Got wise words here. I've been doing co-streams with Crepo, and he told me a Caps quote. Stats don't lie. Liars use statistics. Profound, I know. Caps is a genius. I don't actually think Phreaky is a liar. I think he just didn't actually do the due diligence to make sure that, you know, what he was saying was correct. But, I mean, I definitely think that in a video like this, like, I need to refute this because I just don't think that this is a good point to stand on. I think if you factor in everything I just said, you can cross this one off. Like, let's not talk about Lily and pro play.
Teams were 1 win away from making playoffs, or lost 3-2 inside of those playoffs. How many games could have been won with a stronger champ select? You know, getting an extra ban and letting your opponents pick a weak champion? Some of those games were extremely close and could have been decided off the back of small things like team composition. But only now have most teams realized Lilia isn't good.
After the nerfs.
Speaking of AP junglers, some teams are quick to jump on strong champions when they show up. Heading into the start of the season, Talia was busted.
So I pretty much agree with this Talia point. You can watch it if you want. 13:15 in the video. Yeah, I think that this is a fine point. I think that there's examples of times where the trends in solo queue correlate to pro play, where, like, as you get better and better, and if pro play is considered, you know, better than solo queue, which it definitely is, obviously it's really rough when you just try to encompass all these leagues into pro play. Like, if you took the bottom tier team in the French league and put them versus the top LPL team, it's like you're telling me that these teams are in the same bracket, they're in the same tier bracket. That's a huge fucking just change, and, like, that's so much variance that you're adding for no reason. But yeah, I think that there's sometimes where the trends make sense and there's sometimes that the trends don't. So I want to skip to the Rise point that he makes because he makes it really, really quickly. So he talks about Talia. And does solo queue matter? Now, I think that solo queue is just a tool that you should use. You should use solo queue win rates. You should use builds to give you ideas if you're a pro player to try things out. If something is dominating solo queue, try it out a few games in solo queue. See if you think it's strong yourself and see if you think it will fit into competitive play. That to me is extremely reasonable. I don't think that you should just look at it and be like, well, shit, like, the highest win rate item on this champion is Rylai's Crystal Scepter, and, you know, if Seraphine builds Rylai's and that's the highest win rate, now I need to do that when I play Seraphine. I don't think that that's necessarily, like, how you need to approach it. Okay, let's talk about the Rise point.
When broadening one's champion pool in either solo queue or pro play. As I said, players are better coordinated as skill improves. If you, I'll bet you a bronze player who never looks at their minimap is going to do a terrible job of setting up a gank for Talia.
Probably true, but we kind of have to discount this.
Every Renekton player instantly knows what's up, and that Talia better be starting bot side to tower dive the hapless top laner at level 3. But there's a stark difference between players intuitively being smarter, using pings and intuition, and actual pro teams using voice chat and rehearsing team comps beforehand. Before, we could place bronze next to silver next to gold, and so on, and assume that Masters Plus was reasonably close to pro play. In some spaces, like coordination, it's not close. There's a ton of blank space, and pro play is off the monitor. So any champ who scales purely off coordination, like Rise with Realm Warps, is going to be relatively flat when looking at solo queue, but is actually quite pro viable.
Okay, so I think that this is a perfect point, right? Like, Rise is a champion that I think he's overselling the amount of coordination that Rise needs. I think that coordination around Realm Warp is not as important as coordination around, like, having a mid laner that's split pushing. Obviously, Ryze is one of like the best 1-3-1 champions in the game. Like, how do you use that to your advantage? I think that there's some coordination there. But, I mean, why would we say that Rumble just doesn't have a ton of fucking coordination? Like, this is something that he glances over. It's like 20 seconds in the video. But to me, it's something that, like, I can totally see Rumble being in the same potential, like, issue where it's like, yeah, I mean, it's just not that strong in solo queue because the ultimate is a team fight ultimate. And a lot of times you don't get even team fights in solo queue. Like, even at high tiers, man, like, I play Grandmaster Master games and challengers are in these games. There's still people getting picked off 20 seconds before Dragon. You have to fight 4v5s. So there's a certain type of champion that's going to thrive in that environment. Rumble's the type of champion that has a lot of coordination that's needed. Hey, where are you going to ult? Like, are you going to ult and cut off a corridor? If you're cutting off that corridor, is your team going to follow that up? Like, obviously, if you're in comms, you're like, oh, I'm going to ult the choke. I'm going to ult the choke. You ult the choke. Then your team knows, hey, they can't walk through there. I'm going to walk forward and damage them. Or, like, what about the coordination going the other way? One of your teammates being like, hey, I'm about to, like, flash combo on Alistar. If the Rumble player is ready to line up his ultimate on top of a flash combo, or if Kiana is going for a flash ulti, or Nar is going to flash ulti into the team fight, you want to line up the Rumble ult. Sure, a super, super good Rumble player should be able to, like, notice these, but the coordination obviously helps. I definitely think that a champion that has a team fight defining ult could be in the tier of, hey, you need, like, this champion thrives with coordination. Without coordination, not as good. Can definitely see it through this Ryze tier.
Finally, solo queue data can provide us some quick solves as well. Does your opposing mid laner play a lot of Tristana mid? Well, it's the first time Trist mid has been meta in years.
This is just him pretty much saying, like, what can you get from solo queue? You can see how win rate changes with skill. You can see how win rate changes with practice. Like, if you play a champion more, do you get better at it? I think that Rumble could definitely be something that we could see people getting better at. There's definitely been champions that have existed and not got buffs or nerfs, or not even got them any indirect buffs or nerfs, that have skyrocketed in win rate eventually, just because people have learned how to play the champions better. A bunch of new champions that come out, like, you'll see, like, the win rates, you'll be like, what the fuck is this? And sometimes they barely get buffs, and then suddenly they're just OP because people have learned how to play the champions. I definitely think that this works. I think that what you should be doing, like I've stated earlier, and this is my main point, is you should be using solo queue data as a pro player to give you ideas. And then you should test out those ideas and then use your own brain to see, hey, does this work? Does this not? If you see a pick that's failing all over the place, you shouldn't necessarily say, hey, this is 100% bad. Like, at this tournament, the champion's underperforming. Like, you should draw from your own experience and see, hey, why is it underperforming, and try to understand what the issues with the champion may be. Like I said, I would like this argument so much more from Phreak if instead of just using only solo queue data and data from competitive play, which we've seen very little of. We've seen very little Rumble so far. We just got to hear some takes as to what is wrong with the champion. I have all these. We talked about them earlier. These are the strengths of Rumble. There's probably more than this. These are just a few that I jotted down. So what are the weaknesses? You have pro players that even are playing Rumble, playing poorly, memeing about how bad they're playing, like El Yoya, where he's like, wow, I fucking won a Rumble game. I didn't hit one ult the entire game. Like, he goes and tweets that right after the game. Then he gets an interview. Laurie asks him, hey, like, what do you think about the draft and stuff? And he's like, yeah, I mean, we think that Rumble's the best champion in the game. So clearly, they can make the difference between we think the champion is strong and I'm not playing it well, but it's still strong. Like, it's my fault, not the champion's fault. And that's the main thing that I want to talk about. Like, I think I agree with a lot of the points. Pros are not infallible. They make a lot of mistakes. Why can't it be their fault and not Rumble's fault?
Have a lot of practice games on her. But
so, I mean, like I said, I pretty much agree with all these things. The main thing is that I don't want to use them as, like, direct data where it's like, oh, this trend is showing this. I must do this now. Like, no, I don't want to see that shit. It's, hey, this could be a possibility. Like, pro players should be really fucking good players. Let me try. Let me see what it is. Do I like it? How does it feel? What does my team think about it? Oh, this is what the strengths and weaknesses are. You'll be able to contextualize all these things. I put in a lot of Rumble games. I got my little fucking account here. We got our Masters MMR. I mean, plus 20, minus 14. Oh, Jesus, loss streak lately. On a win streak, loss. I mean, you know how it fucking goes. I played in 30 games of Rumble, so I got a feel for the champion. Like, there's a reason why I think it's strong. Clearly, I've lost some games, but I don't think that I don't think Rumble is the reason I've lost these games. Thought that I played pretty well in some of my Rumble losses lately. Won a bunch of games on Rumble too. Like, it just is what it is. It's the nature of solo queue. This account was decayed from 350 LP, so I get tons of decent games on this account. Yeah, so let's get back to the video. So he talks about this.
It's a viable option.
Like, what can you gain from solo queue? I agree with a lot of these things. Things you cannot do.
I want to be clear that data, of course, does have limitations. Solo queue is not pro play. You cannot account for the fact that some teams are better at playing around certain lanes and some players have different styles. Alphari is 2-8 on Sion all time. Fudge is 7-1. I'm not saying Fudge is better than Alphari. I'm saying Fudge is a better Sion than Alphari.
Why? Because you just said before this that teams play differently, right? So if a team has a strength, like so for example, Alphari's played Sion in teams where he's mainly a carry. If he is now playing Sion on that team and not a carry, how does that affect his team? If Alphari was on teams where he got to play more weak side and he didn't have as big of a role within his teams, like in terms of carrying the game, why could he not potentially be a better Sion than Fudge? I agree that Fudge is probably a better Sion than Alphari, but I don't think that this is like a logic that you can apply. Just like you said, you have to account for a team's tendencies, account for pick order, counter picks, account for the metagame, the new OP builds. Like, what are these players picking these champions? What are the nature of these teams? If Perkz has a horrible win rate on Orianna, I don't suddenly think that like, oh, well, you know, this guy who has a much better win rate on Orianna on a worse team where he has like a different role within that team, he's suddenly a better Orianna than Perkz. Doesn't work for me.
But solo queue data cannot tell you this. Solo queue data cannot tell you about counter picks in the environment. You can look up individual matchups, like how good Sylas is against Malphite, sure, but it takes a lot more work to figure out if Malphite's win rate lowering with skill, it does by the way, is because more players happen to own his counter picks. You'd think as skill increases, fewer players would blind pick Malphite, but you can't know that for sure, and it's not an easy thing to answer. More skilled players also have their ear to the ground. New tech like Moonstaff Lilia has a higher adoption rate in high MMR than in low, or at least had, it's gone now. Despite that, Moonstaff has never been a high win rate build in solo queue. In pro play, where you're more coordinated, sure, it's a reasonable build, and there's an argument for it, no problem at all. But that means back in 11.4, Lilia's win rate would lower with MMR because of build adoption. You can eventually dig in and find this out, but again, that's not easy. We're looking for simple directions. And before you tell me this explains my earlier Lilia graphic, you're wrong about that too. All the data from this, presentation is post Moonstone nerf, and so that build and its inherent biases are not in her statistics. There are more limitations, but again, you get the idea. I'm not claiming solo queue data is a silver bullet. I'm saying it's a worse rap than it deserves. And this brings me to Rumble.
Okay.
I tweeted out after the group stage of MSI that Rumble Jungle is overrated and Rumble Mid is underrated. With it, I included some data that had solo queue win rates on it. Of course, Twitter is not a good platform for nuance, so players took it like this was the only thing I looked at. And thus,
well, I mean, how else can you take it? When I see this tweet and you literally are like, hey, Rumble is bad, and then you only provide data as to like solo queue data and like win rates, like pretty much you only provided not only just like data as like how a champion like performs, you only provided win rate data, and then you took solo queue data and MSI data, and in the MSI data you heavily altered it, right? Like to the point where I think that this can be completely discredited. You missed one game, you missed one win, you took one win away at random, and then you took 3 wins away that you deemed didn't count because a team automatically won, and then you took losses, you left the losses there from those same games, those same team matchups where you can't take anything from it. You left those there, and then you just put random win rates. Like, you can't make a full argument. Like, I don't expect you to like put, hey, this is the reason why Rumble is bad. Like, I've found every single weakness and every single strength, and I've compared them. Like, I'm not expecting a fucking dissertation, but you can say Rumble is bad because of this. Do you think Rumble is actually a bad champion? Do you think the players are bad? I mean, if you said, hey, I think that mid laners are better than junglers at Rumble, I would have been, yep, completely fine. Mid laners are probably better than junglers at Rumble. I can accept that. I don't know if it's 100% true. I don't know if it's factually accurate, but I agree with that opinion. I can see like how junglers played Rumble, and I can assume, hey, people that have probably played Rumble before in different metas, they're most likely better at the champion than these junglers that can't even manage their heat, don't know how to overheat on cooldown, don't know the heat values they should be on throughout the game, can't ult. Half their ult's in the wall. Sometimes 80% of their ult is literally in terrain that is impossible to get to. I can agree with that. But that's not what happened. This is the tweet that we got. Of course people are going to disagree with it when you only use win rates, and then you have other room here. I doubt that this was the max amount of characters you could have provided. If you don't think that this matters, leave it out. Stats credit of this, I mean, you probably should have double checked them, but you could have left this out. We just some reason as to why outside of just win rate, and then we won't have to use the fact that you only talked about win rate as your argument.
So Plat plus win rates are low. I must believe the champion is trash. Yeah, Twitter sucks for discussions. Rumble Jungle seems to be too weak for pro play. even if you believe he's going to gain enough win rate back as skill increases, because Masters Plus is 0.4% higher than Diamond, which is a tenuous argument at best, you still have to pitch that it makes him the best jungler in the game. First of all, he's not, because Morgana is. And second of all, he should just be in the mid lane in the first place. We'll get to that in a sec.
Okay, that's just like a statement that he just says, and he says it really confidently, and you're supposed to accept it, but like, what? Why? Huh? Morgana is. Like, Rumble is not the best jungler in the game. He can't be because Morgana is. Why is Morgana the best win rate? Like, one of the best champions in the game? Like, what did you use to determine this? Did you go to MSI and did you look like, I don't know, like, let's see, maybe you go to MSI and then you look at champions and then you search, actually, let's do it this way. You search champions and you search Morgana. Where are you, Morg? Let me just type it in. Morgana. Boom. We go to Morgana. We go to tournament, MSI. And then we look at the presence and the win-loss. Is it because of the win rate? Like, is that why Morgana's the best champion? When we look at solo queue, I don't know how we even do this, right? Like, Master Plus, it doesn't have the highest win rate. Sure, it has higher win rate than other junglers that are being picked at the tournament. I mean, Kindred was picked, and yeah, I mean, Kindred has higher win rate than it. I mean, maybe we can go to, this is patch 11.9, by the way, which is the patch they're playing on. Let's go to Challenger in Korea. Probably the best version of solo queue. Let's see how many games. Okay, Morgana actually has a decent amount of games. It's 50%, or sorry, 0.5% higher win rate than Rumble. 0.4, whatever. I have a percentage point higher than Rumble. But, like, why are we not talking about Udyr then? Like, if you look at Korea, which is the best solo queue ladder, right? I think that'd probably be the best one to look at for pro play. We look at all this. Rumble's higher than Udyr here. Let's look at Master Plus. Rumble is higher than Udyr here. Like, Udyr has a pretty fucking terrible win rate, right? And Rumble's higher than Morgana and Master Plus, which is something that we're capping off at. It's like a Diamond 2 Plus. Rumble's still higher than Udyr in Korea. And this is not with like a few games. This is 2,000 games. We're talking about, if we're using 15 games as a sample size, we surely can use 5,000 Rumble games, where it's 32% ban rate, 13% pick rate. In the jungle, by the way. So, like, I just don't know where this is. It's all over the place. I feel like all these arguments that he's saying could be applied to Udyr too, but because Udyr is something that we've kind of now accepted is like a super good jungler, no one's going to make that argument. Because Rumble's new, he's like getting bullied. He's like the new kid in school. He's just getting bullied just because he's new. Not because there's any merit to these arguments.
Now keep in mind, we had Lilia fever for almost a year, and only now are players hopping off that
after the nerfs
catastrophe. What's to say
after
they
the
aren't
nerfs
wrong now? He's generically weak by having lower win rates than other junglers in every single skill bracket of solo queue, and he also fails to have...
I mean, if you look at like all solo queue and you look at them all as equal, I mean, generally speaking, I would try to look at the best solo queue you could find, which to me is Korean solo queue, right? Like Korea has generally, the consensus has been, that's been the best solo queue. So in the best version of solo queue, Master Plus, Diamond 2 Plus, whatever, Rumble's a higher win rate champion than Udyr. It's doing super, super well, especially if you consider that it's a new champion and has all these problems where it requires like a unique skill set, requires you to be good at certain aspects of the champion that other champions don't demand. Heat management is a unique concept that probably takes people longer and longer to adjust to. If you look at all those things, then Rumble's doing fine. So, like, I don't even know, like, what the criteria for this is. Like, is this using all solo queues around the world? Are we now saying that, like, we're going to use solo queues that are less populated, severely less populated, that generally have lower skill? Maybe there's ping issues there for the majority of the population that plays there. Like, there's so many different factors that now we're just going to include them all and be like, yeah, I mean, Rumble just sucks in solo queue. Okay.
Strong Azir vibes in terms of gaining power with player skill. Evidence only points to him being a bad pick in the jungle, and yet the internet popped off because I provided evidence to back that claim.
That is not why the internet popped off. The internet popped off because you only used solo queue data as one thing, which, I mean, solo queue data can be used, but it's not the end all be all. And the other thing is you used this weirdly manipulated fraction that we keep on talking about of Rumble being 3 and 7 at MSI. That is why the internet popped off. Because Phreaky is a smart guy. He knows what he's doing, and he intentionally manipulated these statistics to fit his own narrative. That, like, it's not fair at all. It's not fair at all. Even using his own criteria, it's disingenuous. If you want to say that RNG's games don't count, like we said earlier, that you remove the teams that played against RNG when they played Rumble because they couldn't win. No one can win with any champion versus RNG in that group, and RNG's champions, they could win with any champion against the field. Like, that is why the internet popped off. It wasn't because, like, you're like, Rumble is bad, and we're just a bunch of fucking Rumble enthusiasts, like, no, fuck you, man. Like, Rumble's actually, like, insane. Dude, bro, I love Rumble. Rumble's sexy. Like, I'm attracted to Rumble. Don't talk shit about Rumble. Like, what the fuck? Like, I'm not saying that. I just don't agree with this methodology. Like, the internet didn't pop off because of this. I feel like it's such, like, a bad way to present the argument.
It's ironic because if I didn't include any data, that tweet would have gone quietly into the night without much engagement. But because I provided evidence, people assumed that 140 characters is all the thinking I've done. Now let's look at Rumble mid. Not only is mid Rumble generically strong, he's got an Azir curve. His win rate growth is reasonably explained by just looking at MR and going, yeah, actually, people are better using Rumble's strength as they become more skilled. And it's not like this is a meta issue at MSI either. Masters Plus solo queue has Sylas, Yone, Victor, and Orianna, all in the top 10 most picked for mids. Lucian and Zoe aren't far behind. Rumble is actively playing against large swaths of the MSI meta at extremely high levels of skill and outperforming literally every other mid laner. Let me be clear, mid Rumble has the highest win rate in Masters Plus of every mid laner with over 1,000 games in the last month. Yet only chat.
But for me, that explains the point of like, oh, so Rumble got a lot stronger and mid laners already played Rumble. So because Rumble is OP and a lot of these people are like Rumble players, they ended up just shitting on everyone. Like, the champion is disgustingly OP. My point is that Rumble suits better into the jungle because in pro play, people understand how to play the counter picks to Rumble, and people don't allow Rumble to do his thing where he just walks around the whole map and just kills everyone over and over again.
As has played him mid so far at MSI. I'm not even claiming he needs to be 100% mid all the time. Dodging counter picks is a core strength of flex picks. I get that. I'm saying the 14-to-1 ratio of jungle to mid when there is a 6.3% win rate gain in Masters Plus, putting him mid instead of jungle, is something that pros are overlooking, and the uninformed masses on the internet are reinforcing that ignorance. One last.
Well, I consider myself decently informed. So, like, if you'd like to tell me what I'm saying that's wrong, completely down to have that debate. Something else I just thought about is if Lilia was so bad, how did Riot, like, so this is what I don't understand. So, like, pretty much what he's saying is all the data shows that Lilia is bad, right? Lilia didn't even have a high win rate in the tier that they call pro. So why did Lilia get nerfed in the jungle at 11.6 just for pro play? That's what I don't understand, just because it was being seen a lot. So now is that like an issue? If a champion has high presence rate, could it just be arbitrarily nerfed without Riot actually perceiving the champion to be strong in that tier? Like, that kind of like discredits this whole key and this whole idea around balance changes throughout the game. People say that it's them trying to balance all the different tiers, but what I'm hearing now is that Lilia wasn't even good in pro play, so it got nerfed for no reason. It literally got nerfed for no reason, besides for the fact that it was picked a lot and they just randomly didn't want to see it anymore. I guess that's what it is? Sure.
Last bombshell. Lee Sin should be a jungler at MSI. This is his win rate in jungle minus his win rate in mid lane. He's only better mid if you're sub-diamond. Anecdotally, I'm seeing this in the games as well. Lee Sin is meant to be an abusive laner because of how much sustain he has to win constant scraps. But good players just take better fights, and then Lee Sin can only farm, nullifying his key strength. This would be like calling Garen good because his win rate's high in silver. But everyone keeps telling me that, you know, you have to have a fast clear to be viable, and yet Lee Sin excels as a jungler in Masters Plus. So tell me exactly what skills are being recorded here by graphing against MMR that suddenly flip once you hit pro play. Are you telling me the games at MSI look more like bronze games than Masters games? Good luck with that one.
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that, in general, it's the same thing that we talked about with Rumble, where junglers, Lee Sin got a buff. Lee Sin got a buff to jungle and lane, just as Rumble technically got a buff to both. Now, it's where does the buff actually matter the most? By having the ability to Emax, like now, you can't really farm the jungle that much faster that you can keep pace with the top tier junglers. You can actually now wave clear. You get Iron Spike Whip and your E, and you one-shot the wave, and you're able to push, and then, you know, play Lee Sin. You're able to set up ganks. You're able to have all the strengths of the champion, and now you can just push the wave. So, for me, I think this is another example of a champion that is mainly played by junglers, right? And now it's just strong because the jungle players that are good at Lee Sin, that have played Lee Sin for years, like every jungler, even myself, I'm not even a Lee player, but I have thousands of games of Lee Sin, right? Everyone who plays jungle has hundreds and hundreds of games of Lee Sin if you've been playing for multiple seasons because of his strength at different times. I think that just because Lee Sin was buffed and junglers are better at Lee Sin doesn't mean that Lee Sin is better in the jungle.
I looked up Lee Sin top 2 to be fair, and the relationship is identical. It goes from minus 1.8 in bronze to plus 1.6 in masters. Lee Sin is a better jungler than solo laner if you're good at League of Legends. I hope the players at MSI are good at League of Legends. So back to the 3 points of this video, okay?
It's better, like, just because you're good at League of Legends doesn't mean that you're good at all champions within League of Legends. Like, that's just not how it works. And you can't just say, like, oh, this guy is good at League of Legends. Like, this guy is this skill level League of Legends, which now means that every champion that he plays is just going to match that skill level. That's just not how it works. And also, like, yeah, I mean, MSI, it's like you have a bunch of teams that are weaker than teams that we'd see in these regional competitions. So, sure, some of the teams are good at League of Legends. Some of the teams are not that good at League of Legends if you consider them pro teams and you compare them to the best teams in the world.
Data isn't inherently anything. It is a collection of things that happened. If you're smart, you can use that collection to make smarter choices in the future. In League of Legends, you can use champions, items, runes, MMR, you name it, and come away with conclusions that you could be confident in, and use those conclusions to get answers you wouldn't have found any other way. This can help you in solo queue. This can help pro teams find counter picks in their next matches. This can help people shy away from the meta when the picks aren't good in the meta. They also let you check your intuition. There's a difference between banning Gwen because she's frustrating and banning her because she's beating you. She isn't. Pros are not always right. They are the most skilled players, and they have the most at stake when playing matches, so they are trying their hardest to make smart choices. But they're human, and time is limited. They can't explore every option. When Ardent Sensor got buffed, only 1 to 2% of champ selects around the world contained Janna over the next month, and then she disappeared again. 9 months later, she was the most contested support at the World Championship. They are right a lot, and it's their job to be right. But just because pros are doing it doesn't mean they should. Finally, Rumble should be a mid laner, Lee Sin should be a jungler, for the exact same reasons that Azir is good. As player skill increases, so do those champions' performances in those roles. Draft better.
Draft better, man. I just think, like, the condescending thing, I mean, obviously, like, most of us are condescending on social media, but, like, coming from a caster, the amount of, like, draft better, talking to the best teams in the world, when, like, as far as I know, Phreaky doesn't even play the game anymore, like, he barely plays. I don't know, man. Like, to me, it just comes off wrong. But hopefully I compiled all the reasons as to why I don't agree with this take of Rumble being a bad jungler, and, like, hopefully gave you some context as to, like, why a lot of the things that he says in this video sound good, but then if you actually break them down and you see, like, hey, what do you really mean by this? What are you comparing? What stats are you analyzing? There becomes a lot of inconsistencies that don't really make that much sense to me. So, yeah, I think that this was, decent explanation of what I think, comparing it to what Phreaky thinks. And the last thing I want to end with is I saw that Phreaky earlier in the video referenced the Crackdown, saying that, like he saw an interview with Jat where Jat was talking about how he has more time to watch Pro League of Legends now. So I appreciate the view, man. Thank you for watching my content. All right, peace, guys.